council chamber fell silent as Kieran Blackwood stood before the assembled wolves, his silver eyes reflecting the moonlight streaming through the tall windows. He had just delivered his verdict on the 3 captured rogues who had attempted to poison the pack's water supply, a crime that could have killed hundreds. The sentence was not death, not imprisonment in the dark cells beneath the compound, but rehabilitation and community service under strict supervision. The collective gasp that rippled through the room spoke volumes about how controversial his decision remained, even after 5 years of his merciful leadership. Marcus Valen, his head counselor, rose from his seat with barely concealed frustration etched across his weathered features. The older wolf had served Kieran's father, the previous Alpha King, and had witnessed firsthand the transition from the old brutal ways to Kieran's revolutionary approach. Marcus spoke with the weight of decades of tradition behind his words, reminding everyone that in the old days, such treachery would have been answered with public execution within the hour. But Kieran stood firm, his voice calm, yet unwavering as he explained once again his philosophy that every wolf deserved a chance at redemption, that the cycle of violence could only be broken through conscious choice and deliberate mercy. The Northern Territories had prospered under Kieran's rule, in ways that even his harshest critics could not deny. Crime rates had plummeted as former rogues found purpose within legitimate pack structures. Economic prosperity had followed as resources once dedicated to maintaining brutal enforcement systems were redirected toward education, healthcare, and infrastructure. Other packs had begun cautiously adopting similar reforms, watching the Blackwood packs experiment with a mixture of hope and skepticism. Yet beneath this surface success, currents of resentment still flowed among those who believed that mercy was weakness, and that an alpha who refused to kill had no place leading wolves. Kieran left the council chamber feeling the familiar weight of leadership pressing down on his broad shoulders. He had inherited his father's imposing physical presence, standing well over 6 feet, with the kind of muscled frame that came from centuries of alpha bloodline genetics. His dark hair fell to his shoulders, often tied back during official duties, and his face bore the sharp aristocratic features of the Blackwood line, but it was his eyes that truly set him apart. That unusual silver color that seemed to see straight through to a person's soul, eyes that held compassion where his father's had held only calculation and cruelty. The palace gardens offered sanctuary from the political pressures of leadership. Kieran walked the stone paths between flowering moonvines and night-blooming jasmine, plants his mother had cultivated before her death 15 years ago. He remembered her teachings about strength and gentleness coexisting, about how the most powerful wolves were those who chose mercy when they had the power to destroy. His father had called such thinking naive foolishness, but his mother had planted seeds of a different philosophy in young Kieran's mind, seeds that had grown into the foundation of his entire approach to leadership. The bond hit him without warning as he rounded the corner near the ancient oak tree that marked the garden's center. The mate pole crashed through, his chest like lightning, stealing his breath and stopping him in his tracks. His wolf surged forward with a possessive howl that echoed in his mind, recognizing on an instinctual level what his conscious mind took several stunned seconds to process. She was here. After 32 years of waiting, of watching other wolves find their destined mates while he remained alone, she was finally here. Kieran followed the pull with his heart hammering against his ribs, his usually controlled demeanor cracking under the weight of this cosmic connection. He found her in the palace library, of all places, sitting cross-legged on the floor surrounded by ancient texts and scrolls. She was smaller than average for a female wolf, her omega status evident in her delicate build and the subtle scent markers that identified her rank. Her auburn hair fell in waves past her shoulders, and when she looked up at his entrance, he found himself staring into eyes the color of warm honey, eyes that held depths of old pain and hard-won wisdom that belied her apparent youth. Luna Ashford had not expected to find her mate today or any day if she was being honest with herself. At 28, she had survived horrors that would have broken most wolves, had watched her entire pack slaughtered by rogues when she was barely 18, had spent the subsequent decade moving from territory to territory, never staying long enough to form attachments that could be torn away. She had come to the Blackwood Palace as a consultant, hired to authenticate and catalog their extensive historical archives, a job that required her scholarly expertise but minimal social interaction. The last thing she needed or wanted was the complication of a mate bond, especially with the Alpha King himself. The recognition flared between them like wildfire, undeniable and overwhelming. Kieran moved toward her slowly, his hands raised in a gesture of peace, reading the fear and uncertainty flickering across her expressive features. He introduced himself formally despite the absurdity of it, given that everyone in the supernatural world knew his face and his reputation. Luna stood on shaking legs, her Omega instincts screaming at her to submit to the dominant Alpha before her, but she had learned long ago to fight those instincts, to maintain her autonomy even when everything in her biology urged otherwise. They talked for hours in that library, the mate bond humming between them but neither pushing for the claiming bite that would seal their connection permanently. Kieran learned about the Ashford Pack massacre, about how Luna had survived by hiding in the archives while rogues tore through her family and friends. She had dedicated her life since then to preserving werewolf history, believing that understanding the past was crucial to building a better future. Her scholarly work had taken her across the continent, and she had seen firsthand how different packs handled justice, had witnessed both. The brutal effectiveness of harsh punishment and the transformative potential of restorative justice. Luna challenged Kieran's philosophies in ways no one else dared, her survival giving her a perspective that comfortable pack wolves lacked. She asked him pointed questions about the rogues who had killed her pack, whether they deserved mercy, whether forgiveness could be extended to those who felt no remorse. Kieran found himself defending positions he had held for years, but suddenly questioning whether his blanket approach to mercy adequately accounted for true malevolence, for predators who would interpret kindness as weakness and exploit it ruthlessly. Before you continue with this story, if you are enjoying the complex dynamics between mercy and justice, the supernatural romance building between an Alpha who refuses to kill and an Omega who has seen the consequences of unchecked violence, make sure to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more stories that explore the gray areas between right and wrong in the supernatural world. The courtship that followed was unlike anything the Blackwood Pack had witnessed before. Kieran courted Luna with a patience and respect that won her trust gradually. He did not use his Alpha authority to pressure her acceptance of the bond, did not assume that cosmic destiny gave him rights over her autonomy. Instead, he spent his evenings in the library with her, discussing history and philosophy, sharing meals in quiet corners of the palace, taking moonlit walks through the gardens his mother had loved. Luna found herself falling for this gentle king, who carried the weight of an entire kingdom's reformation on his shoulders, yet still made time to ask about her day and listen with genuine interest to her scholarly discoveries. 3 months into their relationship, Luna agreed to the mating ceremony. The celebration was attended by wolves from across the territories, all curious to meet the Omega, who had captured the heart of the merciful Alpha King. During the ceremony, as Kieran placed his claiming bite on her neck, and she returned it, marking him as hers, just as surely as he marked her as his, Luna felt something shift deep in her damaged soul. The mate bond flooded her with his emotions, his unwavering conviction, his deep capacity for compassion, and beneath it all, a core of absolute strength that he chose to express through mercy rather than violence. But the bond also flowed the other way, and through Luna's memories, Kieran experienced the massacre that had shaped her. He felt her terror as a young woman hiding in the archives, listening to her family die. He understood viscerally, not just intellectually, what unchecked violence could do, what predators were capable of when given the opportunity. The experience shook him, but did not change his fundamental beliefs. If anything, it reinforced his commitment to breaking the cycles of violence that had plagued werewolf society for millennia. Life as Luna Queen required adjustments that challenged Luna daily. She was not naturally comfortable with the public attention, with the constant security details and the formal events where she was expected to smile and represent the progressive values of the Blackwood Reformation. But she found purpose in working alongside Kieran to implement educational reforms, establishing schools throughout the territory that taught conflict resolution and emotional intelligence, alongside traditional combat training. She used her historical expertise to document the old ways honestly, creating curricula that showed young wolves the full cost of the brutal traditions some still romanticized. Marcus Valen watched the royal couple with calculating eyes. The head counselor had served the Blackwood line for 40 years, had helped Kieran's father maintain iron control through fear and swift, brutal punishment. The transition to Kieran's merciful regime had been difficult for Marcus to accept, but he had adapted, or so he claimed. In truth, Marcus had spent the past 5 years building a network of traditionalists who believed the Alpha King's soft approach was destroying everything their ancestors had built. They met in secret, these wolves who longed for the old ways, plotting and planning for the day when they could restore what they saw as proper alpha dominance. The network included many of the wolves Kieran had pardoned over the years. There was Derek Stone, who had been caught selling pack secrets to rivals, but had been given a second chance and a position in the palace guard. There was Sarah Blackthorne, a former rogue who had attempted assassination of a minor alpha under Kieran's protection, but had been rehabilitated and now worked in the royal kitchens. There was Thomas Gray, caught embezzling pack funds, but spared execution and allowed to work off his debt through community service. Each of them had been shown mercy when the old ways would have demanded death, and each of them had interpreted that mercy as weakness, an opening to exploit when the moment was right. Marcus's plan was elegant in its simplicity and devastating in its potential consequences. He would orchestrate a crisis that forced Kieran to either abandon his principles or watch his kingdom burn. The conspiracy would strike at the heart of everything Kieran had built, proving to the supernatural world that mercy-based leadership was fundamentally flawed, and the key to breaking the unbreakable Alpha King was simple. They would target his greatest vulnerability, his mate. The attack came on a crisp autumn evening when Luna was returning from a visit to one of the territory schools. She had been reviewing the new curriculum with teachers and had stayed later than planned, her security detail reduced because the route was considered completely safe, deep within Blackwood territory where no enemy would dare strike. The ambush was perfectly coordinated, suggesting inside knowledge of security protocols and patrol patterns. Derek Stone, who should have been protecting her, instead led the assault, his betrayal so shocking that the remaining guards hesitated for the crucial seconds needed for the attackers to overwhelm them. Luna fought with everything she had, her Omega status no hindrance when fueled by survival instinct and fury. She had spent years training after the massacre, determined never to be helpless again. She took down 3 attackers before they managed to inject her with a sedative designed specifically to counter werewolf metabolism. As consciousness faded, she saw Marcus Valen step from the shadows, his expression not of triumph, but of cold calculation. He spoke words that would haunt her, telling her that her death would serve a greater purpose, that it would teach Kieran the hard lesson his father had tried to instill, that mercy was a luxury no true alpha could afford. The bond screamed through Kieran like a blade to his heart. He was in the middle of a diplomatic dinner with visiting alphas when Luna's terror and pain flooded through their connection. He was on his feet instantly, his usual calm control shattering as he registered that his mate was under attack. The visiting alphas watched in shock as the merciful king transformed before their eyes, his aura exploding outward with such force that wolves throughout the palace dropped to their knees under the pressure. This was the power Kieran had always possessed, but had chosen to restrain. The absolute dominance that his bloodline carried, now unleashed without the careful control he normally maintained. Kieran's second in command, Thomas Rivers, mobilized the elite guard while Kieran himself shifted and ran toward the bond's pull. His wolf was massive, black as midnight with those distinctive silver eyes glowing with inhuman intensity. He moved through the forest like vengeance incarnate, his normally measured approach to problems abandoned in the face of his mate's danger. Through the bond, he felt Luna's consciousness fading, felt her fighting even as the sedative pulled her under, and something primal and terrible rose in his chest, a promise written in blood that whoever had dared touch his mate would learn the true meaning of an alpha's wrath. He found the ambush site within minutes, his speed supernatural even by werewolf standards. The 2 guards who had survived were badly injured, and the carnage suggested Luna had fought fiercely before. Being taken, Kieran shifted back to human form, his body vibrating with barely contained violence as he processed the scene. Thomas arrived with the elite guard and immediately began coordinating the search. But Kieran already knew this was no random attack. The precision, the inside knowledge, the specific targeting of Luna. This was conspiracy, betrayal from within his own pack. The bond was still there, distant and drugged but present, giving Kieran a direction to follow. He gave orders with clipped efficiency so different from his usual contemplative style, organizing search parties, locking down the territory, demanding answers from anyone who might have information. And for the first time in his reign, he issued an order that made even his most loyal wolves hesitate. Any conspirator found was to be brought to him alive if possible, but if they resisted, lethal force was authorized. The merciful king had just sanctioned killing, and the implications rippled through the pack like shockwaves. Marcus Valen and his co-conspirators had taken Luna to an abandoned mining facility on the northern border of Blackwood territory, a place that had been closed for decades and should have been off everyone's radar. But Marcus had been planning this for years, had slowly accumulated resources and safe houses throughout the territory. Luna was chained in a stone room deep underground, the silver in the restraints burning her wrists and ankles, preventing her wolf from healing the injection site where they had sedated her. She came to slowly, her head pounding and her body weak from the silver poisoning. Marcus stood before her, no longer bothering to hide his contempt. He explained his plan with the patience of a teacher instructing a particularly slow student. Luna's death would be public and brutal, broadcast to every pack in the territories. Kieran would be given a choice: abdicate his throne and return to the old ways, or watch his mate die slowly. Marcus believed, truly believed, that either outcome would serve his purposes. If Kieran abdicated, the traditionalists would seize power. If Kieran refused and Luna died, it would break him, proving that mercy-based leadership crumbled under real pressure, and the resulting chaos would allow the traditionalists to step in as the strong leaders the pack needed. What Marcus failed to understand was that Kieran's mercy had always been a choice, not a weakness, and that choice extended from a position of absolute strength, not from inability to embrace violence. Luna knew this in ways Marcus never could, having felt through the mate bond the leashed power that Kieran carried. She looked at Marcus with pity rather than fear, her voice steady despite the silver burning her skin. She told him he had made a fatal miscalculation, that he had mistaken patience for weakness and restraint for inability. Marcus laughed at her words, so confident in his assessment of the Alpha King that he could not see the trap he had laid for himself. Kieran did not need the full day to track them down. Through a combination of the mate bond, elite tracking skills, and ruthless efficiency, he narrowed down Luna's location within 6 hours. He arrived at the mining facility at dawn, alone despite Thomas's protests. He had left his second-in-command to coordinate the broader search for the conspiracy's extent, to root out every traitor and sympathizer. This part, the rescue of his mate and the reckoning with those who had taken her, this was something Kieran needed to do himself. The facility's guards were wolves he recognized, had pardoned, had given second chances. Derek Stone stood at the entrance, his expression conflicted as he faced his Alpha King. Kieran gave him one chance to stand down, his voice carrying the absolute authority of his bloodline. Derek refused, emboldened by Marcus's promises and his own resentment of the mercy that he had interpreted as weakness. The fight was over in seconds. Kieran moved with speed and precision that Derek had no chance to counter, his hands finding the guard's throat and squeezing until consciousness fled. Kieran left him alive, barely, but the message was clear. Mercy was no longer on the table. Inside the facility, Kieran encountered 12 more conspirators. Each one was given the same choice: stand down or be removed as a threat. Some chose surrender, throwing down their weapons and submitting to the Alpha King's authority. Others chose to fight, convinced that their numbers and preparation would be enough. They were wrong. Kieran dismantled them with clinical efficiency, every move calculated for maximum effectiveness with minimum waste. He broke bones and tore flesh, his face an expressionless mask that was somehow more terrifying than rage would have been. This was not blind fury, but controlled application of violence. The wolf who had restrained himself for years now showing exactly what that restraint had been holding back. Comment below whether you think Kieran's transformation from merciful king to avenging mate is justified, or if he is becoming the very thing he fought against. Your perspective matters in understanding these complex moral questions. Marcus Valen heard the commotion above and realized his mistake too late. He had believed Kieran soft, had interpreted years of mercy as inability to embrace necessary violence. He ordered the remaining guards to kill Luna immediately, to at least accomplish that much, before everything fell apart. But Luna was not the helpless Omega Marcus had assumed. Despite the silver poisoning weakening her, she had been working on her restraints, using techniques learned from years of studying escape and survival. When the guards approached with lethal intent, she broke free of the weakened chains and fought with desperate strength, buying precious seconds. Kieran burst into the underground chamber like an avenging angel. He took in the scene instantly, Luna bleeding and weak but fighting, guards converging on her with weapons drawn, Marcus shouting orders from the perceived safety of the room's far side. Kieran's wolf took control, the shift happening mid-stride, and suddenly, a massive black wolf was in the room, moving with supernatural speed and power. He placed himself between Luna and the guards, his presence so dominant that two of them immediately submitted, dropping flat to show their throats in instinctive surrender to the superior predator. Nth way, remaining 3 guards attacked together, coordination born from desperate need. Kieran was a blur of black fur and silver eyes, his jaws closing on throats and limbs with lethal precision. He killed 2 of them outright, their betrayal and their attempt to murder his mate placing them beyond any possibility of mercy. The 3rd he disabled, crushing the wolf's leg so thoroughly that even supernatural healing would take weeks to repair. Then he turned his silver gaze on Marcus Valen, the architect of this conspiracy, the wolf who had dared threaten Luna. Marcus tried to run, his courage evaporating in the face of the Alpha King's true power. Kieran shifted back to human form, standing naked and blood-covered in the stone chamber, his eyes locked on the traitor. He spoke with a voice that carried the weight of absolute authority, ordering Marcus to shift to human form and face him. Marcus had no choice but to obey, the Alpha command overriding his desperate need to flee. He stood, trembling before Kieran, trying to summon the righteous conviction that had sustained his conspiracy, but finding only terror in the face of consequences he had never truly believed would come. Kieran approached Luna first, his face transforming from mask of violence to tender concern as he reached his mate. He checked her injuries with gentle hands, his touch so different from the brutal efficiency he had displayed moments before. Luna leaned into him despite her weakness, the mate bond singing, with relief and love and fierce pride in her alpha strength. She whispered that she was okay, that he had arrived in time, that she had never doubted he would come. Kieran held her carefully, mindful of her injuries, and for a moment the stone chamber held only 2 mates reunited, the violence temporarily forgotten. But Marcus Valen still stood there, waiting for judgment. And judgment was exactly what Kieran intended to deliver. He turned to face the traitor, his arms still supporting Luna, and spoke with devastating calm. He detailed Marcus's crimes not just against him, but against the pack, against the Reformation that had brought prosperity and peace, against every wolf who had embraced the possibility of a better way forward. He explained how Marcus had exploited the very mercy he claimed to despise, had used second chances as opportunities to recruit disaffected wolves into his conspiracy, and then Kieran delivered his verdict. Marcus would live, but only barely. His wolf would be bound, an ancient punishment that left a shifter trapped in human form permanently, unable to access their animal nature. He would be stripped of all rank and property, his family's titles and holdings forfeit. He would spend the rest of his life in a supervised work camp, his every action monitored, his freedom gone. It was, in many ways, a fate worse than death, a living reminder of what happened to those who betrayed the pack. But it was not death. And in that distinction, Kieran maintained a thread of connection to his principles even as he acknowledged their limitations. The other conspirators faced similar fates, based on their level of involvement and their choices during the final confrontation. Those who had surrendered received binding and exile, forced to leave Blackwood territory permanently, but allowed to keep their wolves and seek acceptance elsewhere. Those who had fought but survived faced binding in the work camps, their freedom sacrificed but their lives preserved. Only the two who had directly attempted to kill Luna after Kieran's arrival had been killed, and even those deaths haunted Kieran despite their justification. The aftermath of the conspiracy's collapse sent shockwaves through the supernatural community. The merciful Alpha King had shown teeth, had demonstrated that his philosophy of restraint came from strength, not weakness. Pacts that had been quietly skeptical of Blackwood's reformation suddenly reconsidered their positions. Traditionalists who had seen Kieran as a soft target realized their fatal error in judgment. And within the Blackwood pack itself, loyalty solidified in new ways, as wolves understood that their alpha's mercy was a gift that could be revoked, not a weakness to exploit. Luna recovered slowly from the silver poisoning and the psychological trauma of the kidnapping. Kieran remained by her side throughout her healing, his presence a constant reassurance through the nightmares and flashbacks. They talked extensively about what had happened, about the violence he had embraced to save her, about whether that violence meant his principles had failed or evolved. Luna argued that his response had been proportional and necessary, that protecting her life and the pack's safety was not the same as the casual cruelty of the old ways. Kieran struggled with the blood on his hands, even as he acknowledged he would do it all again without hesitation to protect his mate. The reformation of the Blackwood Pack's justice system evolved in the wake of the conspiracy. Kieran implemented new protocols that distinguished between wolves who made mistakes and genuine predators who meant harm. Rehabilitation remained the goal for those capable of redemption, but clear boundaries were established for those who demonstrated through their actions that they were unwilling or unable to change. The new system acknowledged that mercy must be balanced with accountability, that forgiveness did not mean ignoring ongoing threats, that true justice required both compassion and consequences. Kieran also established a new council structure, having learned the hard way that consolidating too much advisory power in a single person created opportunities for corruption. The new council was larger and more diverse, including wolves from different backgrounds and perspectives, with built-in checks against any single member accumulating excessive influence. Luna took a position on the council, her historical expertise and survivor's perspective providing valuable insight into creating systems that actually protected vulnerable pack members, rather than just claiming to do so. The conspiracy had included 17 wolves in total, a sobering reminder of how dissent could fester beneath a surface of compliance. Kieran ordered a full review of every pardon and second chance he had granted over his 5-year reign, not to reverse his merciful approach, but to understand how better to identify wolves who were genuinely seeking redemption versus those who were simply biding their time. The review revealed patterns that informed new evaluation criteria, creating a more nuanced approach to determining who could be safely integrated back into the pack. Thomas Rivers, Kieran's second-in-command, proved invaluable during this transitional period. He had always supported Kieran's philosophical approach, while maintaining a pragmatic understanding of security needs. Thomas helped implement the new protocols in ways that preserved the spirit of reform while addressing the legitimate concerns about safety that the conspiracy had exposed. Under his guidance, the Blackwood Pack developed one of the most sophisticated justice systems in the supernatural world, one that other progressive packs began studying and adapting for their own use. 6 months after the conspiracy's collapse, Luna organized a memorial for all those who had been harmed by the old brutal ways that Kieran's reformation had sought to replace. The ceremony acknowledged that the path forward was not simple, that creating a more merciful society did not mean pretending past harms had not occurred, or that present dangers did not exist. Wolves gathered from across the territories to honor those lost to violence, both justified and unjustified, creating a space for collective healing and commitment to a better future. Kieran stood before the assembled wolves and spoke with hard-won wisdom. He acknowledged his mistakes, his naivete in believing that offering mercy automatically created grateful reformed wolves. He explained how the conspiracy had taught him that true reformation required both compassion and clear boundaries, that protecting the innocent sometimes demanded harsh action against those who would prey upon mercy. But he also reaffirmed his core belief that cycles of violence could be broken, that the old brutal ways had created far more suffering than his imperfect attempts at change ever could, that the goal of a just society remained worth pursuing, even when the path proved more complex than he had initially understood. Luna spoke as well, her words carrying the weight of someone who had experienced both the failures of unchecked violence and the vulnerabilities of naive mercy. She described watching her pack die because rogues faced no systematic consequences, had learned to exploit the chaos of fragmented territories where no higher authority existed to enforce even basic protections. But she also described the transformation possible when wolves were given genuine opportunities for redemption, when society created pathways back from mistakes, rather than only punishments. Her message was one of balance, of learning to distinguish between different types of threats, and responding with appropriate levels of intervention. The years that followed saw the Blackwood Pack become a model, studied throughout the supernatural world. Kieran's reputation evolved from the merciful alpha to the just alpha, a leader who had learned to balance compassion with consequences, forgiveness with accountability. Luna became known as the Scholar Queen, her historical research and curriculum development helping young wolves understand the context and complexities of their society's evolution. Together, they raised 3 children, who grew up understanding that strength came in many forms, that mercy and justice were not opposites but complementary forces that required wisdom to balance. The Northern Territories prospered in ways that vindicated Kieran's core principles, even as the conspiracy had revealed their limitations. Crime rates remained low, because wolves genuinely believed in the system's fairness, rather than simply fearing punishment. Economic development accelerated as stability attracted investment and innovation. Educational outcomes improved dramatically as resources flowed into schools rather than enforcement infrastructure. Other packs increasingly adopted modified versions of the Blackwood approach, creating a broader movement toward more sophisticated justice systems across the supernatural world. But Kieran never forgot the lesson Marcus Valen's conspiracy had taught him, that mercy undefended was mercy that could be exploited and destroyed. He maintained the elite guard at full strength, kept security protocols tight, and never again made the mistake of assuming that kindness automatically created loyalty. The 2 wolves he had killed during Luna's rescue remained the only lives he had taken during his reign, a number he was determined to keep as low as possible, but not at the cost of failing to protect those under his care. The distinction was subtle but crucial. He would always prefer mercy when possible, but he would never again hesitate when violence became necessary to protect the innocent. Make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell to catch our next story exploring the complex dynamics of supernatural leadership and the relationships that test and transform even the most powerful alphas. Drop a comment sharing your thoughts on whether Kieran found the right balance or if his approach still needs refinement. 20 years after the conspiracy, an aging Marcus Valen requested an audience with the Alpha King. He had served his sentence with the quiet dignity of a broken man who had finally understood the magnitude of his crimes. Kieran granted the request, curious about what the former conspirator might have to say after 2 decades of punishment. Marcus came before him bound of his wolf, and diminished, but with a clarity in his eyes that had been absent during his years of plotting. Marcus spoke of his long contemplation, of finally understanding what Kieran had been trying to build, of recognizing how his own attachment to the old ways had blinded him to their inherent cruelty and unsustainability. He apologized not just to Kieran, but to Luna, who sat beside her mate during the audience, for the suffering he had caused and the potential he had nearly destroyed. He asked for nothing, expected nothing, simply wanted to acknowledge his failures before his remaining years ran out. Kieran listened with the same patient attention he had always given to those seeking his judgment, and then he surprised everyone by partially lifting the binding, returning Marcus's wolf for the final years of his life. Luna questioned the decision later, asking if Kieran was returning to the naive mercy that had enabled the conspiracy in the first place. Kieran smiled and explained the difference. Marcus had been thoroughly broken and rebuilt, had spent 20 years actually understanding what he had done and why it was wrong. The partial pardon was not naive hope, but calculated mercy extended to someone who had genuinely transformed through consequences and contemplation. It was, in essence, the system working as intended, punishment leading to genuine rehabilitation for those capable of it. Marcus would live his final years with his wolf returned, but still monitored, still accountable, but no longer needlessly suffering for crimes he had truly come to understand and regret. The story of Kieran Blackwood and Luna Ashford became legend in the supernatural world, taught in schools alongside the histories Luna had worked so hard to preserve. They were held up as examples of leaders who learned and adapted, who balanced ideals with pragmatism, who built something better than what came before, even as they acknowledged their own limitations and mistakes. Their pack flourished for generations, a testament to the possibility that mercy and justice could coexist, that strength came in many forms, that the old brutal ways were not the only path to order and safety. On the 50th anniversary of their mating, Kieran and Luna stood in the palace gardens beneath the ancient oak where he had first felt the mate bond pull. They had grown old together, had faced challenges and triumphs, had learned lessons both gentle and harsh. Luna asked if he regretted the violence he had embraced to save her, if those two deaths still haunted him. Kieran was quiet for a long moment before answering. He said he regretted the necessity of it, regretted living in a world where such choices became inevitable, but he did not regret the choice itself. Protecting her, protecting their pack, protecting the possibility of a better future. Those imperatives had required him to act, and he had acted in the most restrained way possible while still being effective. Luna smiled and took his hand, their fingers intertwining with the comfortable familiarity of 5 decades together. She told him that was the right answer. That moral clarity sometimes required acknowledging uncomfortable truths, that his willingness to embrace necessary violence while still mourning its necessity was exactly what made him a just leader, rather than simply a merciful or brutal one. They had built something worth protecting, and sometimes protection required showing teeth. The key was ensuring the teeth only emerged when genuinely necessary, not as a first resort or a demonstration of dominance, but as a last line of defense for values and lives worth defending. The Blackwood legacy lived on through their children and grandchildren, through the institutions they had built, through the philosophical framework they had developed that acknowledged both idealism and pragmatism. The supernatural world had evolved significantly from the days of Kieran's father's brutal reign, not into a perfect utopia where conflict ceased to exist, but into a more mature society that understood justice as a complex balancing act, rather than a simple choice between vengeance and forgiveness. And at the heart of that evolution was the story of an alpha who had spared his enemies for years, teaching mercy and compassion, until those enemies came for his Luna, and learned that mercy was a choice, made from strength, not weakness, a gift that could be revoked when protection became necessary, a philosophy that could evolve and adapt without abandoning its core commitment to reducing unnecessary suffering. Kieran Blackwood had found the balance that so many leaders before him had failed to achieve, and in doing so, he had changed the supernatural world forever.